Welcome to Ufahamo in Africa, a podcast about life and politics on the African continent. I'm Kimmy Dion, one of your hosts, together with my co-host, Rachel Beatty-Riedel. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Kim. Hello, listeners. So this week's episode is another one by a non-resident fellow, Bamba Ndiaye, about state repression and activism in Africa. And the episode explores the policing of protest in Africa and the mechanisms used by African governments to repress social movements and activists. It also examines the monitoring of activists' digital footprints by law enforcement. So we really have a sense of, the surveillance of the state and thinking about tech in these new strategies of monitoring and suppression of protest and social expression of preferences. Now, Bamba's guest is Bwesigye Bwa Mwesigire, a Ugandan activist. He teaches at Emory University's Institute of African Studies and is completing his PhD at Cornell University in English. He's also a member of the Ubuntu Reading Group Publishing Collective.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, Bamba's episode this week is on state repression, because that's actually where Rachel and I are going to focus our attention. And we're going to look specifically at the racialized state repression that's happening in Tunisia. So Tunisia's president is on the cover of last week's issue of The Continent, our favorite weekly magazine about all things happening in Africa. And on the cover, there's a pithy quote: "Blame Black people." Now, this summary captures the dangerous rhetoric that President Saied has been spewing as he uses Black Africans in his country as a scapegoat for the country's terrible economic conditions. Of course, Americans and Europeans will be familiar with this replacement conspiracy rhetoric, usually typical among far-right and white supremacist movements. As The Continent points out, the premise of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory is that there is a deliberate effort to eradicate white populations by replacing them with non-white populations. Quote, "Hordes of illegal immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa are still arriving with all the violence, crime, and unacceptable practices that entails," the Tunisian president said on February 21st, and then calling on his security forces to quickly put an end to, quote, "this phenomenon." Now, I'm just going to take a moment to pause on his use of the phrase sub-Saharan Africa. It's in this context, he's using it as a euphemism for Blacks. And, some years ago, I was with a scholar from Morocco, and, she was talking about just the use of sub in sub-Saharan, as there's like this kind of subliminal messaging that they're under. And so I actually try not to use the phrase sub-Saharan Africa. Sometimes, like I write in my book why I don't use it, and why sometimes I have to use it, because I'm literally just quoting the World Bank, and that's how they define world regions, right? But I guess I want to use this as like a moment for us to be thinking about and careful with our language. But going back to Tunisia, what has this meant for Tunisians' estimated population of 21,000 African migrants, and also non-migrants, actual Tunisians who are themselves Black, right? And people's inability. I mean, this is the thing about race, is race doesn't tell you whether someone is a citizen or not, right? It lives as a socially constructed information shortcut for people to make their own inferences about whether someone belongs or not, right? Now, there's been this flood of racialized terror and violence, with social media reports of the targeting of Black people, whether from African countries south of the Sahara or Black Tunisians, with verbal and physical abuse. The Continent interviewed a refugee from Darfur who lives in Tunis, and he said that the country had overnight become dramatically more hostile to Black people. He said that being Black, you feel fear always, especially at night. He said that some people throw stones at you. Sometimes they call you a monkey. "My friends have been beaten, and I can't describe it all to you because I can't stand it when I talk about it." Now, some migrants have reported being fired from their jobs, and at least 1,000 have been kicked out of their homes. Hundreds of people have sought protection outside the Tunis embassies of Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, and Mali, and the Office of the International Organization for Migration. various African states are chartering flights home for their citizens. But that's not even a foolproof solution. A recent episode of Africa Daily, a BBC daily podcast on African news, highlighted how even though Ivorians were technically being assisted by their government in this way, right? Free flights home, some were so fearful of entering the streets, of even getting to the airport. They didn't think they were safe to get to the plane to take them home. And so many of them are sheltering in place where they live.
Absolutely, Kim. I mean, it's so important to talk about the way in which, as you've said, the kind of use of racialization within the continent is being used in this example in a very particular way. So I just wanted to share some basic data with our listeners. And this comes from a conversation from The Conversation, which interviewed Jean-Pierre Casarino, who is a senior research fellow at the College of Europe and an expert on international migration in the Maghreb and the Africa region. And he explained that in basic facts, immigration in general in Tunisia is quite small in terms of in-migration, that migrants who are coming from south of the Sahara come primarily from Western Africa, from the region, and immigrants in general from any location count for 0.5% of the national population, right? So it's infinitesimal. Now, there are also different types of migrants who are coming from the rest of the continent, right? Many students come from West Africa to Tunisia because they obtained a scholarship, they want to continue their training in particular universities, and because they have bilateral university exchanges, the very nature of higher ed institutional flows that we highlight. Other migrants come to Tunisia for labor, or because they're en route to Europe. It's just a passing through point. And these might be classified in various ways as irregular. But let's be very clear here that irregularity in any context is far from a choice, right? That category of language is far from something that people seek out. And often it's because even en route to becoming regularized or having the right papers is an administrative and bureaucratic hurdle. It's a long-term process. So you can be stepping through it in the right way and it's taking a long time, right? Like there are all of these reasons why asylum regimes or migration regimes that are put forward by the state are necessarily or consciously, purposefully, bureaucratically gatekeepers and don't allow people to become regularized. So the procedures are often so cumbersome that migrants, such as students, often find themselves in a legal limbo just because they need to extend their stay or they want to do an internship, right? That would be available to other students. We've seen this all across the world. Certainly I see it here with our international students who need to be very conscious of their visa status as they would take advantage of opportunities that are available to other students who are classified as domestic, right? So there are lots of different kind of data elements here. And the country's current policies toward migrants, coming from the article, again, from the expert, suggest that Tunisia's migration policy is selectively discriminatory. And it's quite interesting because Tunisia is very open with European immigrants and very restrictive with non-EU citizens. So the bottom line is that Tunisia's approach to migration and migrants' rights oscillates between the country's need to comply with international standards, right? Like the World Bank has now discontinued the conversations around the next funding round because of the president's comments. And yet Tunisia also has a necessity to maximize the benefits of its many citizens who live abroad. They maximize, their own out-migration to receive remittances and the transfer of skills that are required when you have an inflow and a return home. So this means that Tunisia in general tries to keep its migration policies open, and at the same time, it wants to be a partner to European foreign policy against, quote unquote, irregular migration that is headed to Europe. So its interaction with Europe is often as one of these kind of gatekeepers as well, right? So Tunisia needs to show it can cooperate with the EU and its member states as well as control its own borders. Now, the rhetoric of the president is particularly paradoxical because of this kind of double-faced nature of Tunisia's migration policy as a country that primarily exports migrants, like sends their own citizens abroad, and with a large diaspora living in various countries. So Tunisians are confronted with a kind of discriminatory and nationalist discourses abroad, and when they're living in Europe, right, they face these kinds of same attacks often. So the question then presents, how can a country credibly protect its own citizens living abroad against discrimination and racism when similar flags are that kind of language is being perpetuated at home? Now, the president's comments are all the more striking because a law against racism was adopted in Tunisia in 2018, which was seen as an important step in the legal infrastructure to defend the rights of Tunisians who identify as Black, as well as the country's migrants. So there's this interesting kind of oscillation as well on the domestic policy front. But as we know from examples around the world, and Kim, you just pointed to, in South Africa, in the United States, to be sure, in Europe, using social tensions and kind of discriminatory rhetoric as a means to divert public opinion from difficult economic and social questions at home is a way of often scapegoating foreigners as a common tactic, particularly when these are the socioeconomic conditions that the president is facing at home. Dissatisfaction with rising inequality, with high unemployment, particularly among the youth, with large public deficits, the crisis of the welfare state, et cetera. So these are the domestic factors that are driving this kind of rhetoric of a radical position that's meant to divert attention from the malaise of society.
Right. I love how you're talking about Europe. This whole, it's really only through this conversation with you, Rachel, that I'm actually thinking about Sally Hayden's book, My Fourth Time We Drowned. Mm-hmm. It's this book about African migration to Europe, but it's about the terrible conditions that Africans face actually on the African continent, because Europe has pushed its borders across the Mediterranean and has provided significant financial resources to questionable governments using incredible force against Africans, primarily Black Africans, trying to seek opportunities abroad. And so even just thinking about, it's so powerful when one man in one office can say dangerous things and is abetted by a broader international system, right? Racism is local, but it's also global. And the ability for him to do this, it's not like he's some singular entity, right? There's a system that allows this to happen. Of course, like I'm not saying he doesn't have agency. Clearly, the anti-racism law, right, that you had pointed out, 2018. Well, Saied was elected in 2019. I'm sure if it were up to him, that law would not exist, right? Exactly. He comes to power in 2019, and he uses the coronavirus pandemic to engage in what is the topic of today's episode? Repression, right? So we political scientists would refer to the actions that he took in 2021 as an auto golpe. Now, this comes from the Spanish because this is an act. The translation into English is self-coup. And the reason why, we call it an auto golpe and it's in Spanish is because it happened so much in Latin America that was kind of where the practice was perfected, right? I think of like Peruvian president Alberto Fujimori as the clean example of what an auto golpe is, right? Check him out in 1994. Now, what happened, an auto golpe, a self-coup is not like you're taking yourself out of power. No, it's a way of, while you are in power, you're taking power away from other vestiges of power in the government, right? So if there's any other checks and balances against you, no, you just erase those. And that is precisely what Saied started to do in 2021, kind of using the coronavirus pandemic as an excuse to kind of usurp what are effectively dictatorial powers. Now, political scientist Francesco Tamburini wrote a really detailed article about this auto golpe, and how in July 2021, Kais Saied proclaimed a, quote, state of exception, and he froze parliamentary activities, removed representatives' immunity, and dissolved the government that was headed by the prime minister. Right. So these massive checks on his power. And he was able to do that because there was no constitutional court to prevent that kind of an action. Right. So, courts are important, right? All of these various checks on control are important, but I'm sure some people who have not been familiar with what's been happening in Tunisia in the past 5 years are wondering, like, what about the Jasmine Revolution, right? What happened in 2011? Yeah, indeed, what happened in that time period? There's a relatively new article that actually makes me a little bit more concerned about what's happening in Tunisia, and that's by political scientist Constantine Ash, who's at the University of Central Florida. This was an article that was, honestly, I think it just came out in Democratization, which is an academic journal. The title of the article is Protesting for Autocracy, Economic Vulnerability, and Anti-Democratic Protest Attendance in Tunisia. Now, in this article, Constantine shows that underemployed Tunisians are generally more likely to say that they would attend protests demanding military intervention. And his findings, right, this is using a sample, I think it's a nationally representative sample of 1,000 Tunisians in the study. His findings suggest that economically vulnerable individuals can destabilize unconsolidated democracies, right? So that's what we would call Tunisia, for the non-political science nerds in the audience. What that means is an unconsolidated democracy is a country that was moving towards a path towards democracy, but hadn't fully democratized, right? It had made some steps, but wasn't fully there. So that's why we call it unconsolidated. And that's what we saw, right? 2011, we see this massive move in Tunisia towards democracy, but it hadn't completed. And then you have someone like Kais Saied taking office, right? And, kind of rolling back freedoms, repressing and usurping power so that he's unchecked. Worse, as Constantine Ash is showing us, when you have these economic conditions like you have right now in Tunisia, you're actually going to start seeing popular support for the kinds of activities that Saied is doing. So what may have been one man is now going to have, this kind of massive popular support. And we're seeing that in the racialized terror and violence, right? That Saied is saying these abominable things. And ordinary Tunisians are listening to him and they're following. It's not just security forces that are engaging in this racialized violence against Black people in Tunisia, including Black Tunisians, people who are citizens, who belong. But because of the color of their skin and because of their racist president, they are facing violence, right? And I think this is something we have to be concerned. A lot of people talk about protests as a way to democratize countries, but people need to also remember that mass mobilizations can bring autocracy and can bring violence.
Exactly, Kim. It's so key to really note that when we see the power of the people, we cannot make an assumption about what direction that's headed. And then we need to look more deeply at the structural and agential combinations that lead to pro-democracy, pro-rights, pro-pluralism, or to its opposites, right? So I want to call out to our audience, our listeners, if this conversation is making you think, is giving you food for thought, spurring new ideas, well, send us your reflections. We are now in our call for one-page reflection essays on any topics related to life and politics on the continent. So we would love to hear your reactions. to this conversation, your thoughts about its applicability, how it's taken up in different places, different times, and what it means to you from your vantage point. So please send in your thoughts, and we would love to feature it on a future episode. I also just wanted to share one really interesting new photojournalist book that's out, featured in the conversation on Johannesburg. It's called Wake Up, This is Joburg, which is an amazing collaboration, really, between photographer Mark Lewis and urban planner and writer Tanya Zak. And these striking images are accompanied by really comprehensive texts that follow 10 different stories that are showing the life of urban Johannesburg and the way in which there are so many different narratives, so many different stories. And so it's an ethnographic portrait of one of Africa's most vibrant and intriguing cities. We encourage you to take a look.
Right. And just talking about urban Africa, it just given me a moment to remember that our dear friend of the podcast and former guest, Jennifer Hart, just recently accepted the position as chair of the Department of History at Virginia Tech, right? So congratulations to her. And if you haven't already, go back into our back catalog and have a listen to our conversation with her. It's an interesting take on how we should be thinking about cities and urban spaces in Africa. So with that, let's go ahead and turn to our non-resident fellow Bamba Ndiaye's conversation with Bwesigye.
Greetings and welcome back to the Ufahamu Africa podcast. My name is Bamba Ndiaye, and I'm very delighted to be here to talk with another special guest about social activism in the African continent. So this is, again, part of the Ufahamu Africa Non-Resident Fellowship, and I'm very grateful to be part of the Ufahamu Africa Non-Resident Fellows. And today's conversation will be centered on state repression of social activism in Africa, which is a very topical issue. And to talk about this, I invited a friend of mine, a colleague, and an activist. His name is Bwesigye Bwa Mwesigire. And Bwesigye teaches at Emory University's Institute of African Studies. He's also completing a PhD in English at Cornell University. And he's also a member of the Ubuntu Reading Group Publishing Collective. On top of that, Bwesigye is also a renowned activist from Uganda. He worked with and still works with the Ugandan civil society, but also works with other social movements across the African continent. Bwesigye, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Bamba. My pleasure to be here.
Recently, you wrote a piece in Review of African Political Economy entitled, "What is the Role of the Radical Intellectual in Uganda?" That's the title of the piece. And in this piece, you also talk about a personal and quite traumatic experience of being attacked by unidentified people in Uganda a few years ago. And as a result of the attack, you ended up in a coma for 3 days. And unfortunately, this type of attack against African activists have become quite recurrent in Uganda, but also in other parts of the continent. Can you tell us what happened on that day of January 7th, 2019?
I can say what I remember, and then say what we know that did not happen, and also how far we have come in investigating what happened. So I leave home, which is in Kabale, about 400 kilometers from Kampala, Kabale being in the southwestern part of Uganda, and Kampala being in the south central part of Uganda, and also being the capital of the country. So I get on a bus, intending to, reach Kampala the next morning, and do some errands related to the Free Stella Nyanzi campaign. At that point, Dr. Stella Nyanzi was in jail. Dr. Stella Nyanzi being an academic researcher, but also has become a political activist using her social media. And she was jailed because she had written a poem about President Yoweri Museveni. So I'm also planning to return to the US for the spring semester. So while we're like about 120, 150 kilometers from Kampala, I decide to sleep off. This is about maybe 3 a.m., maybe 2:30 a.m. I don't remember the exact time, but I decide, let me sleep off and then I'll wake up when we arrive. I wake up indeed, or I start to be conscious of where I am. And this is 3 days later. And I'm in hospital. I'm in pain. I'm on drip. So many things are happening. And I am told that we were involved in an accident. And yeah, and that's why we're there. So, I get treated and everything and get out of hospital eventually.
Just to clarify, when you woke up, you were in a hospital bed and you are told that you were involved in a car accident, right?
I was told that the bus in which I was traveling, so I wake up and my mother is there, which is weird, because I had left my mother at home. And then the bus in which I was traveling had knocked a truck. That's what they say. And I got injured. And, that's the narrative that I was told when I wake up. But then after partial recovery, my friends are coming to see me and, to talk about the acts, like what happened. One of them is a journalist, is a cartoonist with one of the daily newspapers in Uganda. And he says, I didn't think your accident or your injuries were this grave. So I say, oh, why? Why don't you think, why did you not think so? And he said, because this means for you to have sustained these types of injuries, this means this was a major accident. It wasn't just a minor accident. And as a newspaper or as a media organization, we get reports of everything that happens, whether it's from the police, about everything that happens on the road. We even have traffic reporters, like people whose specialization in reporting is traffic. And we did not get any news of such an accident, of such a major accident happening. So he says, this type of injuries, the extent of your injuries, if they are from an accident, then this is weird because we should have received the news. And, also said, sometimes they receive the news and do not publish the news, but they receive the news. So he's the one who set off a lot of doubts and showed the red flags in the narrative of the accident. And that's when we started to investigate what happened, but by starting to follow up the leads of the accident. I can say now, and there has been at least one in-depth journalistic investigation, I can say now that we are sure that there was no accident, that no accident happened. We are sure of this because all the evidence that we need for us to be sure that there was an accident, nothing exists. There are no photos. There are no witnesses to say they were involved in an accident with me or were injured. the police, which is, the state institution that would be responsible for a thing like that. And in fact, they have an accident register. Like they have a register of all the traffic incidences that happen in the year. And there was nothing. The New Vision, which is the Ugandan government-owned corporate media group, commissioned an investigation. And the police officers in all the regions near the spot that the accident is said to have happened all said that they have no record of any accident whatsoever. And interestingly, the hospital where a scan was done on me the radiologist reported that my injuries were due to assault. But when I was being discharged from that hospital to go for facial reconstruction surgery, then the same hospital said that I had been brought in and reported as a victim of a road traffic accident.
So they wrote two different reports?
Yes, the two different reports. But of these two different reports, one report from the radiologist is independent of information from outside. It's an expert analysis made by them based on the injuries I presented. The second report, which says I was brought in and reported as a victim of a road traffic accident, clarifies that this was a report as opposed to a medical finding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course, I do not know when we will know exactly what happened, but we continue to look for clues, to look for information, to find out exactly what happened in the few hours that I was not aware of where I was, but also my family was not aware of where I was as well.
Mm-hmm. And to our listeners, you can read part of this story in the recent op-ed that Bwesigye wrote in Review of African Political Economy, and we will give you can find the link in the episode description. Now, let me ask you this. Why would somebody want to hurt you? Is it because of your political views? Is it because of your activism? Why do you think somebody, if the conclusion is correct that this was an assault rather than an accident, why would somebody do something like that?
So this is in 2019, the start of 2019 and the end of 2018. On one hand, there was international attention on the incarceration of Stella Nyanzi, and I was one of the people coordinating the solidarity movement around her incarceration. So this was a global solidarity movement. We had events in Oxford, we had events in Nairobi, we had events in Accra, we had events in Johannesburg, there were events in the US, there were events in, parts of Europe, in Australia, and there was a lot of media attention on the incarceration. So on one hand, the speculation is this was one way of sending a message to those who were in the country and were doing that work, that this was dangerous work, they could be harmed too. And in fact, there was that impact after my incident, and of people shying away from showing solidarity because they were scared. On the other hand, this is before the 2021 quote unquote election, and there was fear of a US funded color revolution happening in Uganda. So at this point, the musician politician Robert Kyagulanyi, also known as Bobby Wine, was, gearing up to contest in the election. So it's not even a year after the Arua protests happened. And the Arua protests being, there was a by-election in the northwestern part of Uganda in which Bobi Wine had supported an opposition candidate under what was then called the People Power Movement. It was an explosive election because there was confrontation between Bobi Wine supporters and the Yoweri Museveni presidential convoy. And Bobi Wine's driver was shot dead. In what many people believe was supposed to be an assassination of Bobi Wine himself. Bobi Wine and very many members of parliament were jailed at this point. And Bobi Wine later said he had been tortured, he had been subjected to cruel and inhuman treatment. But also while he was jailed, there was a global campaign to free Bobi Wine. Free Bobi Wine as a hashtag trended all over the world. You had pop stars, musicians tweeting free Bobi Wine. So there was this international attention on Uganda that made, the government scared that people like me, and I have also a history of curating literary and cultural arts events in Uganda. So, of course, Bobi Wine having made his name as a musician, as an arts practitioner, there was the fear that people who do this type of work, whether it is in literature, whether it is in music, whether it is in film, whether it's in art, in forms of art, that this is what was going to lead to the removal of Mr. Museveni's government. So I believe this is why this attack was staged, but also this is a time when there were tensions between Uganda and Rwanda, and I don't know up to now the extent to which that played a role. But again, we have clues as to those tensions having played a role. So the idea being, or the suspicions being, that Mr. Museveni was working with opponents of Mr. Paul Kagame, and therefore Mr. Paul Kagame also being suspected of working with the opponents of Mr. Museveni. So it was a very, it was a very tense period, and the Museveni regime was extremely insecure and paranoid.
Unfortunately, your experience is not unique. We've seen all across the continent governments trying to suppress social activism. And one of the ways they've done that is to physically attack social activists. I can think of activists in Senegal. Chat of the Yanamar movement was also a victim of such actions. Congolese activists of Lucha and Filimbi also. And I can think of Luc Kulula, who actually tragically died in a mysterious fire, and other activists that you yourself know who have been victim of such attacks. Why are African governments being more and more repressive towards social activists and social activism in general?
I believe that since the 2010-2011, what in some places was called the Arab Spring, since those revolutions in Tunisia, in Egypt happened, at least in the Ugandan case, there has been fear of a youth-led revolution. What in scholarship is now understood as color revolutions, non-violent, built around mass assembly and then demanding for the fall of a regime. But also what happened in Burkina Faso in 2014, and what also happened in Senegal with stopping, I believe it was Abdoulaye Wade, from extending his stay in power. there is a fear, there's been a fear in Uganda in particular of a movement like that, of youth organizing through civil society. And by civil society, I do not mean civil society organizations, but rather, politically engaged citizens. There is a fear of two things: youth-led, but also digital-inspired revolution in Uganda. And not just in Uganda, but also in the neighboring, on the African continent, if we may say that. Even if the fees must fall movement in South Africa might not have been understood in the direction of removing the regime, but definitely that also played a role in how that movement ended or how it was contained, because there was the possibility of that very powerful youth movement leading to the fall of the government. Because remember, it started as Rhodes must fall for the removal of colonial statues at universities, but also the demand for the renaming of some of those universities. And then it moved from that to fees must fall, right? So the logical next step was going to be Zuma must fall. Zuma was the president of South Africa at the time. And then Zimbabwe, you had the This Flag movement, which was also, again, inspired by a hashtag and social media and a mass of young people that were disenchanted with a gerontocracy, with very old people ruling over them, right? And that also, in some ways, contributed to the changes that happened. So there has been, and of course, you've already talked about the DRC situation. Across the continent, there has been mass youth uprisings that are supported by, triggered by, enabled by the internet or social media or the digital. And they're spontaneous in some way. They are not necessarily organized around political parties. And therefore, they become harder to control in the ways that political party activity has been controlled. And I believe this is what is driving very brutal, very cruel, very gory attacks on individual activists, because the system cannot understand the nature of this youth discontent, of this youth organizing, and therefore they use the worst possible tool in their toolbox, which is direct violence. But also, for a very long time, and then perhaps also in line with the spread of the internet and technology, states worldwide, not necessarily just in Africa, states have invested a lot in the use of technology to clamp down protest. And here I'm thinking the Occupy movement, both in the United States, but also in Nigeria. If you remember, there were Occupy protests around the removal of a subsidy. And some news investigations, some media investigations have revealed that Israel as a state, but also state-affiliated companies from Israel have provided software to enable states to curtail popular discontent. So I believe that the states are scared of the potential of technology to support discontent and uprisings, and therefore have invested in turning technology against its potential. So then there's a lot of surveillance that is happening through technology, through the apps that we use, but also there is a lot of PR that is being done using these apps that supports the state narrative. And this can also be this can also be character assassinating activists and entire movements, but it can also be blocking them or hacking into their accounts or, or using bots to send out massive propaganda that then, demotivate or delegitimize movements. So I believe there is a lot of fear at the level of the state, and this is worldwide, but in the particular African context, there is a lot of fear that youth using technology can lead to changes of government so easily, so quickly. And this is why the repression has become extremely brutal. But also to send a message. I believe this is also part of fear tactics to then to say, if you do this, this is what is going to happen to you. So then when they harm you, they are interested in the circulation of the image of you with your mangled body so that other people can see you, to make an example of you. And then other people will be like, okay, I don't want to do that because I don't want to end up like that.
And you might have touched upon that a little bit, but I wanted you to elaborate on the forms of repressions that African activists have been undergoing. So you mentioned, physical attacks against them, but there are other ways that governments can silence social activists on the continent.
So yes, the worst. I'll start with the worst. There've been targeted assassinations in places, and then in some cases they're not even denials. They sort of acceptance. So you hear statements like, "We don't wish our enemies well," and somebody has just been killed. Which is like this state officials admitting that they did it, and these in some places have even happened overseas or outside the borders of the state that is responsible for the crime. There have been also cases of sexual assault, and this affects both male and female activists. There have been situations of activists showing up after they have been sexually violated. The very many activists that have been unfairly dismissed from their work, from their employment, which is, a form of coercing them.
Retaliation.
Yes. There have also been character assassination campaigns against particular activists, whether based on true information, factual information, or absolutely fabricated information. There have also been cases where, let's say, nude photos, and again, this is very gendered, let's say nude photos and videos of particular activists being leaked or circulated by state functionaries as a way of, curtailing their work. There's been naked murder, massacres have also happened. There have been staged robberies, claiming that so-and-so was beaten up by robbers, but when really it was state functionaries that did it. There have been so many torture cases, the images of, tortured activists, which range from, flat irons on people's chests or being whipped so that they end up with, like lines in their backs and things like that. There have been enforced disappearances as well. There was a time in Uganda when hundreds, almost 1,000, or even more, we don't know the exact number, of young people were missing. Nobody could tell where they were, and then some of them who showed up later, narrating where they had been, where they were abducted, where they were being held, and what was being done to them, what they were being told. And of course, there have been lots of trumped up charges. activists being accused of terrorism. That's a popular one, right?
Yeah, like in Senegal right now.
Treason and things like that. And of course, the hacking of activists' accounts, and surveillance. I want to emphasize surveillance because the more we go onto these digital platforms, the more they present as opportunities to mobilize, to organize, but also they have very, very big fundamental weaknesses. And some of those weaknesses are the fact that, your personal information can be accessed if, the state is employing particular software. Yeah, I would say among very many others, those are the sort of forms of repression that are being used.
But there's also exile
Yes.
as a form of repression. There are many, many African activists today who cannot stay in their home country because they fear for their lives. They are basically forced into exile.
And in particular, I want to refer to the Ugandan example. I think for a very long time we could say, oh, people that are leaving the country are not leaving because of the politics. They're leaving because of economic reasons, right? So there was a time when the discourse was migration as of now is no longer about political persecution. It is about economic opportunity, right? So the language changed to, oh, these are not really refugees, because the definition of a refugee, by the international conventions and other forms of law, specifies that you should be running away because of political persecution. So then there was a lot of discourse around, these are not necessarily political refugees. These are economic refugees. They're running away from poverty or unemployment. They're looking for better economic opportunities. But now it's undeniable because there have been some few high profile cases in Uganda, for example. So I've already briefly talked about the Stella Nyanzi situation. So Stella Nyanzi eventually left the country, and she leaves the country after all the things that I've already talked about, having been jailed, but also while in jail have been physically violated to the point that she lost her baby. She had a miscarriage in jail because of the beatings, and of course a lot of surveillance, and being made to feel unsafe in the country. And there are also photos of her being beaten up, pretty much being dragged on the floor. She's in Germany now, but also before she left, oh no, I think after she left, somebody else called Kakwenza Ruchirabashaija, who also is a creative writer, who's written, a political writer as well, who's written critically of the Museveni regime through fiction, but also through nonfiction. So the first time he writes a novel that is satirizing Museveni, and then he's jailed and tortured. And then he comes back and writes a memoir about that jail experience and the torture. That memoir is called, so the first novel is called The Greedy Barbarian, and then the memoir is called Banana Republic. And then he tweets criticizing again the regime. Then he's taken in again, but this time he's beaten worse than the first time. And he narrates stories of being forced to dance through the night, playing loud, very, very loud music that he has to dance through the night. But also he narrates stories of flesh being plucked from his body using pliers. So he comes out of jail, and his body is full of scars. It's like as the zebra. His back is like a zebra's back.
Mm-hmm.
So the scars, because of the whippings and everything. And then his toenails and fingernails were plucked off. And, at the time he leaves jail, they're still healing, so you can't see that these nails had been plucked off. So he's also in exile in Germany. And then there was another activist who was a student at Makerere University. And in 2019, they organized a protest against tuition fee increment, which they had called Fees Must Fall.
Mm-hmm.
And, she was, the leader of this movement. One of the leaders of the movement was violently attacked as well. She ended up in a coma in hospital. And the university expelled her because of that. And she ended up leaving Uganda, and she's now studying in Kenya, which is also a form of exile, There is another one who's just been released, who's another activist called Mugumya Sam, who was taken in a long time ago. He was captured, caught as he was escaping into exile. So he was caught by Congolese border officials. And then he was in jail in the DRC for 8 years. He's just been released, and he's not coming back to Uganda, obviously. So he's also continued on his original journey into exile, if you may. I believe that a lot of these stories of exile, so the ones I have mentioned, are very direct exile stories, in the sense that these people are running away from political persecution. There is no way you can explain they're running away. But I believe, and I want to make the argument, that literally everybody who has run away from Uganda, none has run away for quote unquote economic reasons. Everything is political in this way. So even if the explanations will be, oh, that one went as an international student, or that one went because they found a job or they were looking for a job, that in and of itself is also a political situation. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, there's a very big Ugandan community in the Middle East countries. Even if, we are told, they have run away from Uganda because Uganda has no jobs, but you can see from their political expression the fact that they also are disenchanted by the politics of the country. This is why, and I think this is also true for other countries, this is why the diaspora communities on the continent, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Zimbabwe, whether it is Senegal, whether it's Cameroon, the diaspora communities are all anti-government, right?
Yeah.
Because they understand the reason they are not in the country is because the politics is bad. So they may not necessarily have been tortured in high-profile, mediatized cases, but it's still an extent of political misrule, political discontent that has driven them away from their countries.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, in the face of repression, what can or should activists do?
Yeah, that's a very big question. That's a very big question. I don't have the panacea. I do not know, the fix-all problem solution. But I believe one, particularly activists who have already been baptized by fire, as I may call it, those who have already suffered these types of violations, I believe that we need to start thinking about therapy and mental health as part of the activism, the mental health of the activists themselves that have already been violated, but also those that haven't been violated or haven't yet been violated. I find that most of the movements lack in that aspect. I find that most of the movements do not necessarily provide for mental health support or have strategies around how to manage this situation when it happens, or even before it happens. And here I'm thinking of, Frantz Fanon's that last chapter in The Wretched of the Earth, notes on colonial war and mental illness. I believe that we need to update that analysis in the sense that the means and methods of activism today, which are no longer of direct war, also come with particular mental health needs, whether it is anxiety, and some of it digital derived anxiety, whether it is people, being scared of their images being out there, whether it is paranoia. There are so many things that are happening at that level, and I think activists need to think about. But also, there is need for thinking about protection or safety on the digital plane, because I'm talking about the digital a lot more because most of the contemporary movements use the digital a lot, and I fear sometimes we take these things for granted, or we imagine that these places are safe, or these places are unreachable by the regimes that don't want us to exist or don't want us to do this work. So I believe there is also need for digital protection support. But there's also need for solidarity. There is a lot more need for transnational solidarity among activists, for activists in one country to be aware of what the activists in the other country are doing. So I will give you an example. When Stella Nyanzi was in jail and we were celebrating her birthday, we were worried that perhaps mine and some of my colleagues, our Twitter accounts could be hacked into, or maybe Twitter could be shut down, or the telecom companies could sabotage our access. So what we did was, and we wanted to celebrate the birthday online. She had written some poems from jail that we had sneaked out of jail, and we had let them out. So what we did was send out all those poems to comrades all over the continent and even beyond the continent to post on their accounts in case our accounts were hacked into, or in case social media was shut down in Uganda, which happens very often, right? But I think there is need for that practical, tangible solidarity in the moment. That if this is happening in this country, what can people in the other country that is safer do to support what is happening in this country? So let's say during the election, quote unquote election, in 2021, social media, not just social media, internet generally was shut down in Uganda. So it meant that communication went back to the pre-internet age, right? So then people would have, those who had regional connections would then have to work with their colleagues in Kenya for them to post things, if that makes sense.
I see.
But then, and so because there are not enough networks of that nature, it meant that some activists were cut off completely because of the lack of, regional and international solidarity networks. So I believe that activists need to realize that you're not going to have a revolution in one country in that way without the support of other countries or activists in other countries. But also it's necessary for us to coordinate and connect our struggles. If it is not because we believe in the same vision or same direction or have the same mission, but then we need to do it because it's important for the sustenance of our movements. Our movements depend on each other. And that type of solidarity is very essential.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you when you mention the psychological aspect of social activism, especially on the continent where, sometimes the resources are not always there. And on top of that, you add the repression, it becomes really hectic for social activists. And not many of them have the means to seek mental health support. And I agree with you that it's something that social activists in general should think about. And then you mentioned the transnational solidarity, which made me think of the Afrique Network, which was founded in Dakar after the first UPEC, or Popular University for Civic Engagement. And one of the things that the African Network, I think back then, it was composed of 53 movements. I'm sure it has gotten bigger now. And one of the things they did was to create an entity within the organization to take care of endangered activists, which I thought was a really brilliant idea. So I'll be curious to know or see how that unit created for endangered activists has been operating. And on that note, I would like to thank you, Bwesigye, for coming to the podcast and discussing repression of social activists and social activism on the African continent. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and we hope that you will come back soon to talk more about your work and your activism in general.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And I look forward to...
And thank you to our listeners. This is Bamba Ndiaye, non-resident fellow of the Ufahamu Africa podcast, and I give you rendezvous for another episode on contemporary African activism. In the meantime, stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Ufahamu Africa. You can find more episodes, show notes, and transcripts on our website, ufahamuafrica.com. This podcast is produced and managed by Megan DeMint, with help from production assistants Chukwufunanya Ikechukwu, Alex Kozak, and Ami Tamaklo. Our non-resident podcast fellows are Bamba Ndiaye, Maseke Rioba, Takona Priscilla Sempere, and Kamohelo Tuniko Toledi. We are generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and receive research assistance from Cornell University and the University of California, Riverside. Our music is courtesy of Kevin McLeod. Until next week, Safiri Salama.